Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today. And we have heard now about digital synthesis and the development, and I want to go back some centuries for talking about the history of voice synthesis. And let me start with a short quote. Without any doubt, it would be one of the most important inventions if someone would develop a machine that could produce all sounds of our speech. If you then equip such a machine with keys like an organ or a piano, it would be amazing to everybody hearing this machine speaking whole speeches. Preachers or speakers who have an insufficient voice would then be able to play their speeches on such a machine just like organ players now do with their musical pieces. To me, something like that seems not to be impossible. This quote by the German mathematician and polymath Leonhard Euler from 1773 illustrates precisely the dream of speech independent from a human speaker. But this dream is much older than this quote. It existed a long time before Euler. Already, for example, in 1699, the French philosopher and mathematician Bernard Lamy sketched his thoughts on the possibility of creating speech by something like an organ. I will talk about that more in the afternoon. To give you a short overview about what I'm going to talk now, I want to show you some of the talking heads of the Antiquity and the Middle Ages, then turn over to the heyday, so to say, the 18th century, then to the successors and epigones of the 19th century, the upheaval in the 20th, and talking heads 2.0 in the 21st century. So the imagination of artificial voice is very old. There are legends of a speaking machine or a speaking device at the Oracle of Lesbos already in antiquity. In the medieval period, allegedly Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon worked on this topic and constructed so-called talking heads. There's a story or a legend that Albertus Magnus showed his speaking head to his pupil Thomas Aquinas. But Thomas Aquinas was so frightened by this, as he thought, work of the devil, that he destroyed it promptly. During the following centuries, there were several approaches to get speech into inanimated matter. Some centuries later, Anastasius Kircher presented in his book Musogia Universalis several ideas how to construct such speaking heads. But in all these cases described here, there were artificially modeled heads made from brass or from clay, and they were often made very realistically, but only the outer appearance. There was no insight that it is the inner character of the head, of the mouth especially, that is responsible for articulating speech. Until the late 18th century, there was a lot of these talking heads that had been presented, and all of them were soon unmasked as frauds, because the speech was always made by real men and transferred to the heads by tubes. In 1783, the development of these talking heads reached its climax. The French cleric Abbé Michal presented a pair of talking heads to the Academy of Sciences at Paris. As most of their predecessors, they were made from brass and sculpted very lifelike, as you can see here on the right. They were able to perform some sort of dialogue, as you can read here. But the quality of their speech was very poor. People needed to read the words simultaneously to understand it. This was caused by a fundamental change in the design of the apparatus, because there was no longer a human speaking through the heads. The speech of this machine was truly synthesized. This was arranged by a large set of different organ pipes placed behind the heads and operated by a very complex mechanic. Although this approach had no reference to human anatomy and its performance was really poor, this is nearly the first speech synthesis we know of. We don't know much about this apparatus because Mikhail destroyed it in 1784. I said nearly the first speech synthesis. The last decades of the 18th century seemingly were the right time for a whole number of speech synthesis prototypes. If the meager reports are correct, some years before Mikhail, around 1770, the English physician Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Sir Charles Darwin, developed a device that could babble simple words like mama or papa. This machine was presented at the Birmingham Lunar Society, and a contract was drawn up. If Darwin succeeded in developing this machine so that it could speak the Lord's Prayer and some other lines, he would gain the enormous sum of 1,000 pounds sterling. But apparently he did not succeed. And there's only a short paragraph of himself describing the construction of the machine. So when Mikhail presented his talking heads in 1783, he had already worked for many years on this topic. We do not know how much time it has taken him. But almost simultaneously with Mikhail, there was another premiere of a speaking machine. But this had no similarity with the one of Mikhail. In 1779, the Petersburg Academy of Sciences published a prize issue that was based on the idea of Leonhard Euler mentioned at the beginning of my talk. For this competition, there were two questions. First, what are the differences between the vowels A, E, I, O, U? Nevertheless, they show very much similarity to each other. And secondly, is it possible to build a device based on a pipe organ that produces these vowels? The German-born physicist and toolmaker Christian Gottlieb Kratzenstein won the prize. He had been at the Petersburg Academy for some years until 1753 when he went to Copenhagen. And Kratzenstein was also in touch with Leonhard Euler for many years, who thought of him as a brilliant scientist and a very good toolmaker. Because Euler had much influence at the Petersburg Academy, it is not out of the question that he had influenced the competition to give Kratzenstein an advantage. So, in his treatise, Kratzenstein designed a theory of speech in general and of vowel production in particular that is somewhat bizarre. Although he was a medicinist by profession, he had less insights into those processes that are responsible for the production of speech. So, for instance, he thought the epiglottis to play an important role for the vocalization, which is completely nonsense, of course. But exactly this wrong conclusions guided him to a speech synthesis model which had a large influence during the 19th century. But not in the area of speech synthesis, but in the area of organ building. I will tell you more about this in relationship in my second talk in the afternoon. At its core, Kratzenstein's device was based on 5 organ pipes, one for each of the 5 vowels A, E, I, O, U. These pipes were reed pipes, so a vibrating piece of thin metal produced the sound. At the upper end of these reed pipes, there were 5 resonators you can see here on the right. Each of them should produce one vowel of the 5. And as you can see on this scheme, the shapes of those resonators had little to do with the articulation a human needs to produce the relating vowel. Kratzenstein had determined the shapes only by trial and error and without any physiological basis. Kratzenstein's own description of this vowel organ is very vague, and we do not have any reports of someone else. And just like the devices of Mikhail or Darwin, it seems to be lost, so that we could not say anything about its effective quality. Let's now get to the most famous and most misunderstood researcher on speech synthesis in the 18th century, Wolfgang von Kempelen. Unlike most of his colleagues on this topic, Kratzenstein for instance, Kempelen was no professional scientist, he was no academic at all. Born in the then Hungarian city of Bratislava, he had a career as a civil servant for the Austrian monarchy. But in parallel, Kempelen was a very bustling tinkerer. Through all his life, he invented a variety of mechanical things. He made, for instance, several waterworks, and steam engines that attracted the concerned attention of James Watt himself. In addition, there were various medical inventions, so to say. He designed, for example, a sickbed for the Empress Maria Theresia and a sort of printing press for a blind artist. This was a predecessor of today's Braille printers. But Camberlin became famous in a very sad way by his most well-known invention, the automatic chess player, or so-called chess Turk. Even today, you can read many wrong and imprecise things about this apparatus. This is mostly due to the wrong co-UvA reporting about the machine, which was taken over by several authors until today. This is not the place to redeem the chess Turk, which it may deserve, but let me say this, there was a trick, yes, but no fraud. And because of this darn chess Turk, Campbell's most far-reaching invention I'm not going to talk about was placed in a bad light right from the start. In 1783, Wolfgang von Campbellin started a journey through Germany, France and Great Britain to present his famous as well as infamous chess Turk to a wide audience after it had caused a stir in the world already for 15 years. During this journey, he also presented in another of his inventions, if specially requested, the speaking machine. Due to the rumor about the chess Turk, there was a lot of skepticism toward this thing. Nonetheless, it had been described in at least 2 publications of these days. Both descriptions contained a very detailed drawing, you can see here on the right, on this speaking machine. So, what was it like? Was there also a trick like for the chess Turk? No. There was no trick. Campbell's speaking machine was the first really basically functional speech synthesis based on physiological principles. It is very important to note in this context that it was not a physician like Kratzenstein who made this fundamental progress. Campbell had no scientific education at all, but by his fundamental and by his profession as an engineer, he was able to observe and to deduce things in a very open-minded way. This ability distinguished him from many other researchers of this topic in that time. So he came to insights that are mostly valid until today. And based on these insights, Campbell tried to replicate any part of the human anatomy that is necessary for speech production. That resulted in a design you can see sketched here. Campbell had undertaken many attempts to find a convincing model for the human glottis. Mostly, he had tested various musical instruments such as a trumpet or a sackbut. Finally, it turned out that double reeds can produce a very voice-like sound, but they are difficult to handle and therefore not suitable for this purpose. So Campbell used a single reed, as you may know, from a clarinet or an organ. In the 19th century, for many decades, the 19th century was for many decades characterized by reverberations of past speech synthesis concepts. Especially the work of Wolfgang von Campbell and Christian Gottlieb Kratzenstein stimulated several researchers to go on with the development of their concepts. In 1791, Campbell had published his book, Der Mechanismus der menschlichen Sprache, The Mechanism of Human Speech, in which he also gave a very detailed description of his speaking machine. You can see 2 of his own drawings here. Based on this, at once several replicas were built. We know of replicas built around 1795 by co-UvA reports of Georg Christoph Lichtenberg and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Around 1830, there were even 2 Englishmen reproducing and developing the work of Kratzenstein and Campbell, Robert Willis and Sir Charles Whetstone. Willis was mostly interested in the work of Kratzenstein. In his eyes, Campbell's physiologically based conclusions of the production of vowel sounds were falling short. Instead of that, he found that Kratzenstein's abstract approach was completely sufficient. Willis found that synthesizing different vowel qualities is indeed possible using simple tubes acting as resonators. According to Kratzenstein, he used 3 reeds for excitation. The second one you already may know, Sir Charles Whetstone. He was a major British scientist of his time, and amongst other things, he discovered the principle of the dynamo electric machine, but tragically, Werner von Siemens, just 10 days before him, had handed in a paper to the Royal Society, in which he presented the same findings as Whetstone. Some years after the work of Robert Willis, Whetstone published an extensive article in which he discussed the work of Kratzenstein and Kempelen, as well as the one of Willis. Unlike Willis, he was mostly fascinated by the work of Kempelen. Because of that, he made a very close replica of Kempelen's speaking machine. It's the oldest preserved Kempelen replica we know of, although it's in a very bad condition. There are many legends and rumors about Wolfgang von Kempelen, but the next of his successors is even more enigmatic than Kempelen ever was. Neither we do know the exact date of birth of Joseph Faber nor when he died. We just don't know if he was called Joseph. We do know anything about his profession. Sometimes he was called professor, but that does not mean anything. Seemingly, he came from Vienna in Austria. Around 1843, this peculiar man exits the mist of history by presenting a machine to the public which is called Euphonia, the well-sounding. And again, we do not know any certain thing about this. There are some reports about this machine, including at least 3 different illustrations of it. You can see the 2 best of it here. The Euphonia was based on Kempelen's speaking machine. You can see Kempelen's machine right here. Here it's the wind chest, the bellows, the mouth. As Kempelen himself had already suggested, it was equipped with some sort of keyboard over here, and the bellows could be operated by feet instead of the right elbow, as it is for Kempelen's machine. The rubber funnel of the mouth, right over here, was seemingly movable and seems to have had some sort of tongue representation, which was completely missing in the original speaking machine of Kempelen. Allegedly, the machine was able to sing a hymn at the end of every performance. But reports of the quality of its synthesis are very contradictory. Some say it was very convincing, some say it was very poor. And after Faber's death, the curtain of history closed again, and there are no further reports on the Euphonia. It got lost like most of the other speaking machines of this time. The last of many researchers inspired by Kempelen I want to talk about, every one of us knows, Alexander Graham Bell. He was not only the developer of the modern telephone, but also the son of one of the very first phoneticians, Alexander Melville Bell. Both father and son dealt with the problem of how to make so-called deaf-mute people understand speech and how to teach them speaking themselves. Already as a child, Bell got into contact with Charles Whetstone and his replica of Kempelen's speaking machine, which impressed him very much. Because of that, he built a speaking machine by himself, for what he studied Kempelen's book in detail. But unlike Whetstone, he wanted to refine Kempelen's machine, so he took a real human skull and tried to rebuild the human anatomy in it. To us, this may seem bizarre, but these experiments at least led to the development of the telephone. At the beginning of the 20th century, there was a fundamental change in the research of speech synthesis, as it happened in almost every scientific field at this time. The possibilities of electricity lead to completely new concepts. At the same time, final refinements of the concepts of Kratzenstein and Kempelen were made. So, for instance, in 1937, Robert Ries of Bell Laboratories presented a mechanical talker. You may already know this scheme. And you can see on the drafts, this device was a detailed reproduction of the human oral cavity. Although the mechanical realization is much more complex than it was in the older concepts, this device is deeply rooted in the tradition of Kempelen because of the excitation by a beating reed right here. At the same time, and also at Bell Laboratories, there arose a different concept, a completely different concept of speech synthesis. During World Exhibition 1939, Homer Dudley presented his VODA, which stands for Voice Operating Demonstrator. This was the first fully functioning, non-mechanical voice synthesis. But to a certain extent, tradition is always preserved. The VODA is operated like a keyboard instrument, as you can see here on the right. Because of this, the VODA rats, the female operators of the VODA, had to practice 1 year before they were able to operate it fluently. And everything the VODA said was prompted before by a human speaker, so the auditory knew what to hear now. This method was already used by Mikal or by Kempelen. Although this first speech synthesis produced by electricity was very much improvable, it was the forefather of most speech synthesis until today. I said most. There are still, or again, attempts to combine speech synthesis with a natural-looking appearance. At the end of my talk, I want to show you two of the most remarkable concepts of this manner. As some of you already know, particularly in Japan, there are researchers designing android robots. These machines should be able not only to act, but also to talk independently. For that, it is necessary that the synthesized speech is not limited by means of inflexible lexical or acoustic parameters. Therefore, those androids should be able to create speech in real time like a real human does. The Waseda talker is one of those approaches that try to remodel everything of the human anatomy by biomechanical solutions and operated it by very complex digital controlling. The very last concept I want to show you is another modern adaptation of the talking head idea, but in a completely different way than the Waseda talker. The fur-head social companion head is no more speech synthesis as his name already suggests. Instead of that, it is a concept for real interacting with people. So there is not only a speech synthesis, which is done by digital means, but also a speech recognition unit which is linked to a high-performance computer. By this, it is possible to conduct a real conversation with this device and getting reasonable answers to one's own utterances. But with this concept, the development is beyond the area of pure speech synthesis. It will be very exciting which way of the development of speech synthesis will take in the future, and if the dream of real talking heads finally some days will become true. Thank you very much.
Like to go first with a mic. Well then, oh yeah, Hannah, please.
I have a question. You told us that before von Kempelen, the synthesis of the voice was done based on the sound and not on the production. While in that time, of course, they didn't have all those tools for analysis. So could you perhaps explain a little bit more about how they knew what the sound was or how to build the sound of the different vowels?
They did not know. They couldn't analyze it, of course, so all they did was trial and error. So, for instance, the device of Mikal, there were more than a dozen organ pipes for 5 or 4 vowels, and some fricatives. So all they could do were trying, and looking what is the best. There were no empiric approaches to get sound human-like or speech-like. It was all trial and error.
Who would like to? Oh, yeah. Oops.
I haven't seen all of your talk, but could you say something about the reception of these machines?
The reception was very different. In the 15th and 16th and 17th century, the talking heads made some rumor, but as the public got to know that all these talking heads were frauds, there was much anger against it. So when Campbell came up with his true speech synthesis, he had huge problems to explain that there was no fraud. So the meaning of the public was very changing, and there were many public publications of this time talking that's all fraud and don't believe him, he's a treater, and it was a very complicated thing.
And you've shown us beautifully that he himself was busy publishing on it. So luckily we owe this treatise to that very problem, perhaps. I've seen a question here. Is that right?
Yeah.
No? Yeah.
I was interested to hear more about the, let's say, the diphthongs, the transitions over time. How much was there an issue? Because organ pipes are static, and you could do all sorts of static sounds, but these people must have been, let's say, very interested also to have this dynamically changing vowels. And what were the solutions for that? Can you be more specific about this, or is there more written about it?
I want to talk about that in the afternoon. To make it short, that's the core of the problem. People knew if we combine organ pipes to get some vowels, it is not possible to get these vowels into a whole word or whole phrase. So that's the core of the problem Campbell solved. The question of co-articulation, to combine single sounds to a word, to a phrase. That was not, there was no solution on this before Campbell. And for instance, the speaking heads, talking heads of Abi Mikal had exactly this problem. It was A, B, C, D, with some pauses between the letters, thank you, and the pitch could not be changed, and changing the pitch is a problem Campbell could not solve himself, but he had recognized that changing the pitch is very important to get normal or natural speech.
Yes, but actually, the question was, you have read all those old things that are written about it, and between the lines you can read the frustrations of the inventors or the thinkers, and that's the interesting part. Yeah, was that also their main frustration in building these machines, the things they couldn't make?
I think so, because you can read, for instance, about Mikal. He built two devices in 1779 and 1783 and destroyed both of them because of frustration, as it may seem.
Yes.
So are the legends.
Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful lecture. Can you say something about the sources that people tried to imitate? Because I think that if you live in Germany in the 18th century, people had a quite different language from, for example, France in the same time. So what quality of sound, is there something to be known about the quality of sound that, for example, von Kempelen tried to imitate, to reproduce?
For instance, German is real hard to speak for the speaking machine, and Kempelen himself let his machine speak Italian, French, Latin, so languages with many voiced sounds and many nasals, many vowels, and German with the much of fricatives and plosives is very hard to perform with all of this speaking machines, and it is very notable that, for instance, the talking heads of Mikhail are speaking French, so language with much vowels and nasals. So the problem of unvoiced consonants is not that big as, for instance, in German.
Was that perhaps one of the reasons that von Kempelen's machine was considered a fraud by so many people? I guess many German people would think, well, that thing doesn't speak German at all.
It could speak German with, but the problem that the machine, or not the problem, the case that the machine was able to speak different languages, that was one of the cases why the machine was thought of a fraud, because the people said, why could it speak French and Italian and Latin? There must be some intelligence in this machine. Of course, the intelligence is the player, but they didn't understand that.
More questions? Otherwise, I jump in. Just to follow up on this, to my knowledge, one of the favorite sentences for imitating in artificial language or artificial speech is "I love you." So there you have a sequence of almost vowels only, and to my knowledge also Kempelen's machine could say "je t'aime." I've heard it once, but it sounded like "je t'aime," so really sad. But nevertheless, I would like to turn around the question that we already had about the frustrations, namely about those happy discoveries. And I once encountered a moment in von Kempelen where he says, "My family came running down to me asking, 'Who's talking here?' And have you encountered more of those moments when people are so amazed about those voices coming from nowhere? And what's your impression about how long do they pertain?"
That's an interesting question, because when we first presented the replica you will see in the afternoon in 2007 to the audience, there were several babies and small kids in the audience. And when I started to play Mama and Papa, all the babies began to cry. All responded, "Mama, Mama." So they were very impressed. The parents weren't, they were amused. So if you have some knowledge about what is going on, you may see and hear the things in a different way than if you just hear something in another room, thinking, who's praying there?
And I think there's one more question, is that right? No? Is it just a fingering? No. Who would like to ask another question? Yes.
The voices, were they female or male? Was there a preference? Because these days it seems to be female mostly.
Childish. It's the voice of a 3 or 4 years old child. You could, of course, change it, make it lower, but all coeval reports of the Kempelen speaking machine say it's the voice of a little child from 3 or 4 years old. And Kempelen himself says that's a very good thing, because for a little child it's not bad if a child could not very could not speak very precisely and babbles. So if you hear a child's voice, you will not be that critical to that quality of its speech.
Yes, another question.
Hello. I'm very interested in the Faber machine.
Okay.
Does ever anyone else try to build it, like rebuild it, like what they done with the Cumberland one?
No, there are several guys thinking that would be very nice to have a reconstruction of that, but all we know, or all we have, are these 3 pictures. There is no description at all. So we do not know how he did that. And if you look at the mechanic, it seems to be very complex.
Yeah.
So you will have some organ builder or something who spends many hours in developing such a device and doing that for no money. So it would be very, very interesting to have a replica of this, but it's much more complicated than doing a replica of Campbell's machine.
The last 2 new talking heads, do they have a tongue in them or not?
Do you mean the historic talking heads?
No, the new one, I don't remember the name of that.
2.0.
Yeah, 2.0 talking heads.
Yes, they seem to have a tongue, but let's say if we have some sound here, I can demonstrate you the sound quality. There is a tongue, but judge yourself. Could you understand anything? E, E, A, or O should this be? And that's biomechanics of the 21st century. And as you will see in the afternoon, the vowel quality of Campbell is not much lesser than that.
I think this is a nice promise for this afternoon. But for the moment, let's thank our speaker again. Thank you, Fabian.